Okay, so thank you very much to Rita and Barbara for inviting me to speak at this session. I'm really delighted to be able to do that, and thank you to everybody here for joining. My name is Rachel Burley. I'm the Vice President and Director of Open Access at Wiley-Blackwell. And I wanted to just talk about one particular model of peer review that is being used in open access at Wiley-Blackwell, which is commonly known as the cascade model. I think Michaela did a great job of giving us a really good overview there of lots of different types, so I'm not going to cover any of that ground again. But what I do want to do is just give you some background on how we're doing this at Wiley and why we're doing it. I have a case history for one of the journals that we launched in 2011. And just to give you some numbers of author uptake of this model of publishing, and then I wanted to just sort of put some questions out there at the end about what do we think this might mean for the future of publishing, because it could have some significant implications or not. So, rationale for peer review reuse. Again, Michaela had referred to this. It is a huge frustration for both editors and authors and peer reviewers that the number of times that a paper can be peer reviewed is multiple, and this it's hard as journal publishers and on the editorial side of things to find reviewers who have enough time to review the number of papers that we're pushing through to them. And the pool of good peer reviewers is quite small, or it feels quite small. It's also a very it offers convenience to authors, and I'll talk a little bit more about how it does that later on. But it's just the idea that if your paper doesn't need to undergo a second round of peer review at a separate journal, if that peer review is passed with the paper, it's going to reduce the time to publication. And then it's, for the publishers in the room of us, it does reduce costs for publication. There is a cost attached to peer review. If you don't need to do it twice, then, there's no need to do it twice. So it benefits all parties. So some of you will know Wiley-Blackwell. Wiley has a huge journals publishing program, as well as major reference works and books and quite a few other types of products. But our key activity is scholarly journals, and we publish just over 1,400 of those. The scope of coverage that we have is the life, health, physical, social sciences. We also have some veterinary and professional titles, and so it really is the full spectrum of disciplines, and half of those journals that we publish are on behalf of our society partners, so we really are a society publishing partner. I dug around in our Scholar One and our submission systems this week to see how many submissions we received last year. This number is as close as I can get to accurate, but 425,000 is the number that I came up with. It's probably bigger than that because that doesn't include all of the different EEO systems that we're using. So clearly it's a huge number. And then I filtered that to see how many of those are actually primary research. And some of the numbers that will come after this are focusing on the primary research because it's the type of paper that we're currently cascading. The rest of the papers are reviews, some of them are major reference work papers, book chapters, so it's the whole spectrum. So in terms of what happens to these papers after they reach Wiley, there's a fairly large proportion that are accepted. Well, 44% are accepted at some stage post-review, but 19% of all the papers we receive are not peer-reviewed, and they're rejected before peer review. And 37% are peer-reviewed and then rejected. This is an average across 1,400 journals, so clearly there's huge ranges in how this looks at the individual journal level. We publish Angewandte Chemie, which I believe the rejection rate is 90%. So, there are others that the acceptance rate is much higher. So I applied some numbers to those categories, and the interesting one in terms of the topic we're talking about here is the huge number of papers that are rejected. So there's 82,000 post-peer review, 42,000 pre-peer review. So 125,000 papers roughly that pass through each year. So I calculated how many peer reviewer hours that was, and I based it on a very, very minimal peer review time of 1 hour per peer reviewer. I don't know if anybody here knows an average time it takes to peer review. No, any suggestions? Does that seem about right? I mean, I would. It's possible.
That's very, very short.
That's what I was thinking. Okay, so I think this is probably the minimum amount of time it can be done in. Most papers have 2 or 3 reviewers, but let's say they have 2, just for this example. So last year we conducted 28 years of peer review, or at least the peer reviewers working on behalf of us did. Shall I say a command?
Reject. What is that?
We won't stare at you.
Siri.
So I think, the message that comes out loud and clear from this, and Michaela's already said it, is that, passing on referee reports is clearly a sensible thing to do in certain instances, and it's going to save time and energy spent on peer review. And that's really the basis for the programme of open access journals that Wiley launched last year. So these titles are now live and launched. I just tell you a little bit about these before I move on to the model. The first 2 journals launched in the spring last year. That's Brain and Behaviour and Ecology and Evolution. The others have launched subsequently, with the last 2 having been quite recent in 2012. The model that we select, we do have other open access publications at Wiley, I should say, so we do have titles that have moved from subscription to open access, and we also have the hybrid model, which is called Online Open for Wiley, but I'm just going to focus here on these fully gold open access titles. So they're online only, they have a Creative Commons non-commercial license. There's variable article publication fees that range from $1,650, I think, at the lowest end, and I think it's something like, I think it may be as high as $3,000 for the upper end. We do conduct full traditional peer review, so there's no alternative peer review model in terms of the type of peer review. It's just the reuse of peer review for the cascaded papers. So that's the part I just wanted to talk through. I think some people may know different models of Cascade that have been used. I should emphasise this is purely the one we're using at Wiley, so it may not apply to other Cascade titles that you're familiar with. So we basically, excuse the fairly crude graphics as we go through here, I just wanted to illustrate the process, but we basically selected journals that have high impact factors and high rejection rates across our portfolio and looked at, how many of those papers they were rejecting we would have actually liked to publish. The numbers were quite surprising, as you can imagine, with a big portfolio of journals. Some of these journals were rejecting very high quality content, which was then lost to the journal and lost to Wiley, and so what we really wanted to do was to create a mechanism to capture more of that content. So the referring journals are selected on quite strict criteria, and I'll show you some of them in a moment, but the editors are all given the same brief, which is that the papers that you are rejecting because they're out of scope, or because they don't quite meet the priority bar for your own journal, or perhaps they're not the right paper type. So, for example, some journals we publish don't accept case reports, and so those would make a paper for cascading. So they have been given a brief on the type of papers to refer, so we're not asking them to refer everything, we're asking those editors to actually make one editorial decision at the point of rejection. this is how, I mean, actually, it wasn't an easy thing to convince them to do, believe it or not. I mean, they're quite reluctant to change workflow in general, quite often. What we've done is put in an additional decision selection in the Scholar One system, so that when the editor is rejecting a paper, they have an additional option, which is reject and refer the paper. At the point that the editor at the referring journal end has clicked that button, there is no further work for that editor individually, but there is a little bit more work for the editorial office in transferring the files. So the model, we are looking at doing this for single journals. I think Nature Publishing Group have a good example of where this works for single journals. They have huge numbers of rejections from Nature. I'm sure most people are familiar with Nature Communications, which is has papers that have cascaded both through Nature and through Nature's sister journals. And then underneath that, they have scientific reports as well. So they've really designed a mechanism to sort of not let anything escape. But the model works for multiple journals as well. And in fact, that's the model we've employed. And the referring journal editors are all basically creating a pool of papers. Let me just go back to that one a second. Which the editor of the open access journal then is using as a pipeline for content. So the author receives a rejection letter, which is always a bit of a sting, obviously. But and within that letter is a paragraph saying, unfortunately your paper was not accepted for publication for whatever the reason was. However, it is a good candidate, in my opinion, for this secondary journal. And at that point, the recommendation is made, and there's a link in that letter for the author to, if they decide to submit. So the submission transfer process, this is the Ecology and Evolution homepage. So basically, once the author has decided that they want to take up that option and they click, yes, I would like to submit, at that point their paper is transferred. And I think this is quite an important point around that, because we made the decision quite early on not to harass authors in any way from the open access journal end of things. So if the author at this stage chooses not to submit the paper, or they're not interested in being referred, then they don't hear from us again. We do have some referring journals where the editors actually like to prompt the author if they don't take up the option, and will say, are you sure you're not interested? But most of the referring journals, that will be the final communication that they would hear from us about this title. And just to say about the peer reviewers here as well, the peer reviews that are passed on with the papers, in the guide to peer reviewers on all of our sites, we do state that your peer reviews may be shared. I've never heard of any complaints or criticisms of that. The papers that get published, we don't actually go back and tell them you reviewed this paper, and it's something we may consider doing at a later stage, but they are informed that it's a possibility through our websites. Is this all making sense so far? Okay. So once that recommendation has been made and the author submits, the paper is transferred, and we do that for the author. So at the editorial office end, the manuscript plus all of the referee reports will be collected and passed on to the editorial office system for the open access journal. And the author doesn't really have to do very much at this stage. In fact, let me just go back and... So basically, the author does need to complete a couple of additional fields when they're in the manuscript submission system. So they will need to... It'll be pre-populated with all of the data that could be collected from their original submission, in the interests of just helping to speed this process for them. But they do actually have to accept responsibility for paying the paper. The article publication fees are collected before publication for these journals and not after. So they do actually have to see a quotation for what this will cost. They're sent an individual quote which will have any discounts they're entitled to applied, and they just have to accept responsibility for it. And they may need to fill in 1 or 2 additional fields, but there's really not very much extra work for them. So this is Ecology and Evolution, which has, without doubt, been the most successful of these journals that we've launched. The others are all doing extremely well, but this one has really stood out as being a high performer since it launched. So there's 11 journals that refer papers to the Open Access Journal. They're shown at the top. The average impact factor is 5.78 for that group of referring journals. I think one of them is 15 impact factor, and then I think the lowest one is about 2. But the journals were selected on the basis that the things that they are rejecting, we want to try to capture the top 10% of that. Clearly, it's not easy to do that because the author will make the decision about whether to transfer the paper. But our aim is to go for the quality publications from the rejections and not just to capture everything. So this group of journals rejects approximately 4,000 papers a year. And in the 11 months since this journal launched, I'm sorry, my keynote is running away with me here. So from those 4,000 rejections, I thought it was going to do it again, the 1,700 authors elected to transfer their paper. 1,700 editors referred the papers to the Open Access Journal. So this is where the editor has said, okay, this paper is good enough to be passed on. We're doing everything we can to just work with the editors to make sure that we're getting the right stuff, because in the early days post-launch, they're not always referring the things that they could. And, one of the reasons for this is that these editors are leading very high impact, very prestigious journals, and they can't help but apply their own thinking, even when they're making the recommendation. So we're asking them to, pass on the next tier of papers, but sometimes they just can't bring themselves to do it, quite honestly. So we're encouraging them. Of those 1,700 referrals, 210 authors transferred their paper, which is 12.5%. And this is actually a fairly consistent transfer rate across all the journals that we publish in this model. The lowest one is 10, and I think the highest is 13.5. So it's fairly, we're fairly confident that, with this model, you could model in a sort of 12.5% transfer rate for papers, provided you've got, the referring journals, the group of referring journals are the correct quality. 200 papers have been accepted, but that includes direct submissions as well, and there have been 80 direct submissions to this journal. So this is really, this is a very, very new journal, and it's very successful. I mean, I think from, the author's perspective, they're extremely satisfied with it. We've had feedback from the editor that they're delighted with the process and how smooth it is. 2 of those journals are referring 75% of their papers, and that's really the main pipeline for it. And the editors of those 2 journals just are really delighted to be involved in this. And then the editor of Ecology and Evolution is a very well-connected editor, and he's, hugely proactive in his community. And so this actually is a big success for a Cascade model journal. And when we're considering other journals in this model, we're looking at what went right with this one, because they're not all like this. And so I'll just come on to some lessons to be learned in a little while. So I mentioned the source of articles. So 72% are coming through the referral process, which we would expect in year 1. By the time we get to the 3rd year of publication and hopefully have an impact factor, we believe that percentage will go down significantly, at least to 50% and possibly less. 3% are invited articles, editorial board members and others that we've invited, and then 25% are from direct submissions. And then the kind of interesting thing that also came as a surprise to us was that of the papers referred, just under half of them don't come with peer reviews. And that was a bit of a sort of, let me see if I can put that a better way. Rita just frowned at me. So about 50% of the papers that are referred from the referring journals do not have an existing peer review with them. And the reason for that is that we had anticipated that the things that had been peer reviewed would be the most likely candidates for referral. But in actual fact, the feedback from the editors is that, well, if I've peer reviewed them and rejected them, then that's because there's something wrong with them. But if they're just out of scope for my journal, they may be perfectly good papers. And so those are the ones that we are receiving a lot more than we thought. And I think the message there, just for this model, is that you have to build in, the ability to do full and rigorous peer review at the open access journal level, because, you're not just going to be able to recycle everything. So there's clear benefits for authors, which we mentioned before, that we can actually get papers published once they've been referred in 15 days. If the editor accepts the previous peer reviews and the paper is good to go, then it's possible to do that. We almost never do that for two reasons. One of them is that authors invariably ask to revise their paper based on the previous peer reviewers' comments, even if we don't ask them to. And so there's quite a lot of re-review going on, even for the papers that come with the peer review. I think it's fair to say the review is still being reused because they're reacting to the original comments. But in some cases, the papers just aren't reviewed again. There's no need to. We just accept them. So all of these things, can hopefully lead to a much faster and smoother process for authors. So this is just a snapshot of the uptake across the program, rather than just for ecology and evolution. And I only included the journals here that had published issues as of this month. So it was only 4 of the 6 that I showed you earlier. But it's a healthy picture. It's what we were hoping to see. Let me just see if I thought I had some numbers to come up there. So it's about 3,500 papers referred across the whole pool. And then the transfers is in the region of about 700, and we have direct submissions of about another 110, I think. And then we're accepting about 25% of papers that are coming through this route. So I'm quite interested in, I'm hoping we'll have a bit of a debate about all of the things we've discussed so far, but I'm quite interested in, first of all, just sharing the lessons we've learned, and then also putting some questions to you. So at Wiley-Blackwell, we do have confidence in this model. We believe it's successful. It's what we anticipated in terms of the referral process. The author uptake is higher than we thought. We thought about 5% of authors would take up the offer, and in fact it's nearer to 10, 12. Some of the editors are very pleased to be able to offer this as a soft reject. They feel like they're not just turning the author away, they're actually offering them an alternative. And then I mentioned some of the other things in the slide before. I think that, the one key takeaway, certainly for me, was that you have to engage the editors at the referring journal end, because if you don't get that part right, they're either not going to refer at all, or they just won't refer the right papers. And actually they are compensated at Wiley, so for every paper that gets published, there is a referral fee that goes back to the paper, to the journal that referred the paper. So there's a value in it for them doing it. And we've got lots of interest in this model, and it's quite tricky navigating in terms of, business planning and thinking about the future. Clearly Wiley is a big publishing company that has a large program of subscription journals. We want to expand our open access offerings. This model has a lot of interest, but quite often the requests to create journals in this model are not necessarily feasible. You really do have to have a fairly reasonable size pool of rejected papers from the referring journals, otherwise you're just not going to be able to get that pipeline. And in our financial modelling, a rule of thumb was that if you can get to 100 papers that you think you'll publish, then generally speaking, it'll be feasible. So these were sort of questions, really, rather than statements. But I was thinking this through as I was, putting this presentation together. And, one of the things that's occurred to me is in working with, our proprietary and our society journals is that there is some element of cutting off the pipeline of papers for other journals in this model. I think it's too early for anybody to actually have any statistics about that or to demonstrate it. But you can easily imagine that if, in the example I gave about Nature, I worked at Nature 10 years ago, and, things that were rejected just went out of house. And subsequently now there's new tiers of journals that have been created to capture this content. And ultimately some at the bottom of the pile, you would imagine, are going to find their pipeline drying up. But it's, just a question to put out there. I think, the cascade model is a good way to start new journals. I don't necessarily think it's sustainable sort of 5-6 years after publication. I think, already for Ecology and Evolution, the pipeline of direct submissions is quite high. And I think authors start to find the right home for their papers, and, so we may not necessarily be using this model further down the line. But I don't know. I would put the question out there. Is there going to be a whole new tier of cascade model journals that just duplicate the brand and the scope of the original journal, but they're just one tier down? Because you could imagine that, couldn't you? You could imagine every single journal has a secondary journal that scoops up the rejections, and it's sort of quite strange to think about how that would look, and whether there's a possibility of that becoming reality. And if it does, what happens to the primary journals? What about third tier cascade? So I think some journals are already doing this, but is it acceptable to refer the author onto another journal after that? And, are people...
Like it, that's for sure.
They don't like... Oh, you've done it, have you?
Yeah, well, I can give you some examples.
Okay, well, I'd be really interested to hear those, actually, because I don't know the answer to that, but... and then, I was sort of taking this to its extreme, and this is really not, this is just thinking what could ultimately happen in the future. I suppose if you were thinking from a researcher's and an author's perspective, you might think, well, why not just have everything peer-reviewed in some central place, and then, once that's happened and it's graded, filter it into the relevant publication so there's never a secondary peer review. I don't like that very much. I don't, certainly wouldn't be great for me. But would it be a logical way to go, and would it make sense? So those are just, actually I'm going to leave those up because that's the end of my slides, but those are just some of my thoughts. But I'm sure, I'm hoping some of you will have questions, and I'd also be interested to hear Michaela's thoughts on the third tier cascade. Thank you. Oh, sorry, any questions? Yes.
The cascade model seems to me to rely a lot upon initial review quality, which raises the question, in my mind at least, as to what do you set? Do you assess anything about review quality? So, I can envision that authors might not agree with a review, and often you have systems where you have only 2 reviews going out, and I think it's pretty well established that those reviews often don't even cover the same, don't agree.
Yep.
So someone will claim major flaw, and the other one doesn't see anything appropriate. So, how would that work with leaving aside the 50% there, as you say, just soft, and they're not within scope. The ones that actually have a rejection that original editor thinks is substantive. How often do the authors disagree, the other reviewer disagree, and how is that resolved without going to get a further review?
Well, unfortunately, I think it does go to another review round at that stage. I think if there's significant enough dispute surrounding it, the referring editor probably wouldn't refer it on in the first place. But I think if they do get to the open access journal and, perhaps one of the reviews seems slightly random or inconsistent, those do exist, then we would invite somebody else to review it as well. I think you get that in any publication, and I think those papers generally, either the editor will make a decision and sort of, based on their own judgment, or the papers will get rejected, or the authors will be asked to make revisions. But I think what happens in the cascade process is some of those we just don't get them, and some of them we send them out for another review. And actually sometimes, as I mentioned, the authors will want to act on the reviewers' comments themselves. They're not happy to just allow this to be published given that they had these mixed reviews.
I actually have a question. So at ASM, we very often have to deal with issues of scope because there's so much overlap. And I'm assuming with hundreds of journals, and including 11 journals that feed into the Evolution Open Access Journal, what about transfers between the higher quality journals on scope issues? Do those editors collaborate, or do they just reject for scope and it goes immediately to the second tier?
Well, I think that's a really good point, actually. Thank you for raising that. So actually, just to talk about brain and behaviour briefly, because that's one of the other titles, and there is a neuroscience peer review consortia, some of you may be aware of, for that journal, and so the journals actually between different publishers will share the peer reviews for those titles that they've opted in. For some of our journals, there are, in the ecology and evolution group, it could be that there's more than one recommendation to the author. So it might be that it's suitable for either this open access title or it's suitable for one of the other journals. I think I haven't actually heard any feedback about editors. I did have one comment from an editor that he had always referred a certain type of paper which would definitely fit the scope of the open access journal to another journal, and he was really reluctant to give up doing that. And of course we said, well, that's fine, continue to do it, and if you could just mention this one, which is also appropriate for the author as well. But I think that whole kind of, I think the Neuroscience Peer Review Consortia is a fabulous idea, but the use of it is dismal. I don't know if anybody here knows the numbers. The last time I looked, I think we'd, over a 10-year period, maybe published 3 papers that had been referred from that group. So it wasn't really a success, but that might be because it was multi-publisher based.
Yeah, we have similar experiences with it. We've got one journal, Neural Development, that started participating early on, and we also find it's not much more efficient, actually. It means the authors don't have to go through another round of peer review with new referees, but in terms of time, by the time everybody who is involved has been communicated to, it's actually not saved the authors much time. But so maybe they didn't have to spend time revising and addressing additional references.
I can comment about that briefly. So this peer review consortium was started while I was at Journal of Neuroscience, and I can tell you that the intent was never to serve the authors. The intent was to serve the reviewers, who were seeing the same papers 2, 3, and 4 times, and figured if they'd reviewed it once, they just did not see the need to review it again if it went to a second or third tier journal.
I'm glad you raised the Neuroscience Peer Review Consortia. I was sort of waiting till the end in case somebody else raised it. And we have one journal that participates. And I think it also depends where you are in the tier. There's a real hierarchy within that consortia amongst, and it's multi-publisher, as you mentioned, and it is neuroscience journals. We're kind of tier 2. And we get a number of papers referred. Our editor chooses to re-review most of them, but the difference and the significance that he likes is that the acceptance rate of those that were referred is much higher than the overall acceptance rate for the journal. So he's happy with it. He felt also that the authors had a really hard time figuring out what to do for the first year or so as to what the process was. And it seems to work for some of the journals within the neuroscience community, and I was just wondering, throwing out for now or for later, what we think the future of something like this is for other communities, whether it could work outside of neuroscience, whether it's possible to recreate a cross-publisher, which always seems to be really difficult to do, much less cross-journal operation, and whether the value of whether it's saving peer reviewers, whether it's saving reviews, whether it's facilitating time, which we haven't found either, or whether it's simply a higher acceptance rate is something that is useful to pursue cross-publisher, cross-journal in different disciplines. That's a question.
I don't have an answer, but I have a different question. I think the cascade model makes a lot of sense, but I don't quite understand the motivation of how the cascade model and open access are interacting. So Could you tell me a little bit more about the motivation for that and what?
Point.
Yeah. Go
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Rachel. I mean, I think I would just reiterate what Michaela said, is that these things could apply to any model, subscription model, or to the open access. It just so happens that so the launch of new subscription model journals right now, as far as I can tell, is pretty stagnant. I don't think we've launched that many over the last year or two. So I think anything new that's created now tends to be in the open access model. And so that's the reason why we've applied it here. I don't think the two things are closely married together. Any other thoughts or questions? Actually, one thing I didn't say that Rita just reminded me about was that not all of the peer reviews come with the identity of the reviewer revealed. So it varies by journal. Some of our referring journals are hugely protective of who their reviewers are, and I think that's a common phenomenon, and they're kind of concerned that we'll go back to them and add them to the reviewer database and put more pressure on them. So for those journals, we blind them out. The vast majority, 90% or so, the reviewer's identity is known to the editors of the referring journals. And, you can imagine that they find that really helpful. And I think it sort of feeds into the question you asked earlier, actually, about, what happens if there's a big difference of opinion between the reviewers. And clearly, if you know who they are and they're people you're familiar with, then you can use that to help inform your decision about the paper. Yes?
Does the receiving editor see just the comments that went to the author, or both the confidential comments from peer reviewer to editor and the comments to the author, because they can differ?
Oh, yes. I mean, I've learned a lot about that recently, actually. They only see the comments to the author. The diplomatic stuff, because I've been told that some of the email exchanges and other comments are really not fit for human consumption. I don't know if that's true, but so we just send them the polite stuff. And, I'm sure they'd like to see the rest, but we don't let them.
So I think this is actually a really interesting point. At Neuroscience, one of the changes that happened as a result of this peer review consortium was that Journal of Neuroscience got rid of confidential comments. So whatever the reviewer had to say had to go into the review that was shared. And the reviewers, if the reviewers did not agree to have their names revealed, then the review couldn't be transferred also, which I think is pretty important, at least in that field. But one question that I have for the people who have experience with open peer review, if you tell reviewers up front that their comments are going to be published, especially with attribution, are they more polite in their reviews and more diplomatic? Just curious.
It's hard to control for this properly, because you don't know what they would have said if it wasn't open. But I think looking back at the BMJ RCTs, they did actually try and dissect this quite carefully, and I think they found overall they had quite interesting ways of measuring quality of a peer review and having. If you look back at the actual papers which were published, obviously, they had multiple editors judging independently and blinded the quality of the review not knowing whether the referee had to reveal the name or not, etc. And it was pretty consistent. So the editors couldn't actually tell, for example, whether this referee had been told that they could do this anonymously or had to reveal their name in this particular trial, and they didn't seem to spot a difference between them. I mean, that's one study. It's hard to tell. You could look up all of our not all of them perhaps, but some of the pre-publication histories on our journals, just to see whether you have a feeling that they are just as negative or impolite as
There's probably the reason why more of them decline, perhaps because they can't control
I think
themselves.
I mean, it does. Yes. But
I know that there are a lot of people that reserve the comments about what they really think for the
confidential comments.
Yeah. You sound as though you'd seen quite a few of those communications, and that's why you were asking. Thank you. Yes. Sorry, did you have another question?
I was going to have that from hearing all this, it's kind of troubling when you think about it, because if it actually is someone talked about it, soundness, it's really something flawed. It should be easy to say in a relatively neutral way. One has to wonder, and also seeing some of these offline, so to speak, comments are more political. They're things that really aren't really appropriate, actually.
I think that is where the editor's role come in. That editors often do have to push back to referees and say, you have to substantiate your claims here with references, or what. If you say it's not an advance over previous publications, you have to tell us where the previous publications are, or so that's where the editorial role comes into play. Rachel, I have one question, and then maybe that will lead us to the transferring authors to a third journal and beyond. So you said that your open access journal that is the one that is called Ecology and Evolution.
Yeah.
Okay. Not just the cluster of journals that you were referring to.
No,
so the actual journal is called that. So you said if you're expecting to get an impact factor within the next 2 or 3 years, or within 2 or 3 years of its launch. What do you think will happen? You said you would expect fewer referrals, or would you expect the editor to change his or her attitude towards what they're willing to receive?
Well, so it's an interesting point to debate, and it's very early days, obviously. I think on this particular journal, the editor, all editors strive for high impact factors. I mean, that's what they're all trying to do, and it doesn't matter where the journal is positioned in the market, people are always trying to move up a tier. I don't think we would ever get him, or any other editor to say, well, I'll just not bother. Having said that, with that particular journal, the quality of the things that are being referred right now are higher, probably slightly higher than the things that are coming in as direct submissions, and that's just because of the journals that are in the referring journal group. I think I would imagine that in year 3, at the point we get an impact factor, that the direct submissions would increase significantly, because then there are many authors that just won't publish unless there's an impact factor. So I think at that point it would open the door to a lot more direct submissions. I was trying to imagine what might happen to the cascade process. I think it's possible that open access will become so prevalent in 2 or 3 years' time, and that the authors will actually make that decision up front that they want to publish in an open access journal, and so therefore there may not be as much going through that through the referring journal in the first place. But that's just guesswork on my part, and that may not be the case. But that's how I would envisage it. So probably between around 60-70% of the pipeline will come from the referrals for the first year or two. I would imagine it will drop away to 50 or 40 after that, and then at some point, who knows? But perhaps we wouldn't be doing it at all. But I'd be interested to hear what others think about that as well. Does anybody else have experience of this cascade model of publishing? Anyone else in the room working with a cascade model journal? Oh, okay. So nobody can argue about what I said then. I could have made it all up.
I'll just answer that question about the what happens when authors are referred to a third journal. In our experience, once a journal does have an impact factor and the editor wants to up the game, it becomes a bit more difficult to establish these connections between sort of the higher tier journal and the next journal. And the communications are then really essential between those editors, that they understand each other's scopes and threshold levels. So what gets referred from the higher journal to the lower journal is actually appropriate. So authors aren't told, well, go to the next journal down, and then that editor is actually not particularly keen. And at that point, the author gets referred to a third journal, or so they are not happy with it.
Yeah.
And so that's a real challenge, actually, that we...
Okay. Yeah, because I remember, because we debated at some length about the being rejected twice part, when we first employed this model, because the idea that you get, rejected from one thing and then, I know authors are used to this, but if you've then been invited, as it were, to submit to another paper, a journal, and then you're rejected from that, it's sort of a double whammy, really. Yeah. But we haven't had, I think it is quite prevalent, so we haven't really had negative feedback about it.
I have another question, and this is kind of based on something Rachel Bernstein said earlier about what's relevant to open access about this. And so my question would be, what do the editors, the authors who are initially submitting to a subscription journal, they may not think of it that way, but they're submitting a particular journal that is a subscription journal, they're being referred to a journal that's an open access journal. Is that a distinction that hits them? What are their reactions to it? What's required of them, of course, will be very different, because probably in the first instance, I'm guessing, are they paying anything? And because in the instance of the open access journal, they are. So what's been your experience with that referral from one, well, it may not be prominent in the author's mind, it's from one business model to another where there are cost implications?
That's a good question. Thank you, Rita. We don't have an awful lot of data on this yet. There are author surveys. We're trying to, to understand a bit better how authors react to this. We do have a little bit of data on papers that are withdrawn after submission. So the process will be, after you've been offered to submit and you decide, you click, yes, I want to transfer my paper. Occasionally authors will get beyond that stage, so they submit their paper, we transfer it between the journals, we immediately start the production, the production process with the paper. The author at that point will have accepted responsibility for paying for it, so they would have seen a quote and they would have been told this is what it will cost. Quite often not quite often, in a few cases they've overlooked the detail of that quotation, and then they will come back to us with a fee waiver request, and they'll say, actually, I don't want to have to pay for this. And at that point, we have a fee waiver policy, and at that point, we make a decision on whether or not we'll fee waiver the paper, and if we don't, then they withdraw it. I haven't seen... There's not a lot of that, actually. So I think out of all of the papers, out of 460 odd papers that have been transferred, I think there's about 9 of them. So it's quite a small percentage. So I think that's one way of answering your question, is that, people are sort of, there is a point where they're saying, okay, now I need to pay. And there is some pushback to that from some authors. I think, I remember one of the editors mentioning the word integrity to me about the referring journal editors, saying, he didn't feel comfortable with referring authors to a journal where they were going to need to pay. I understand the thinking behind that, but we haven't had a problem with it. And in my sort of discussions with editors and authors and colleagues, I think the idea of paying an article publication fee is so accepted now by such large proportions of, at least, the life sciences and health sciences author community, that people don't actually have a negative reaction to that. I'm just trying to think if there's cases where they might, but another sort of point, we just did a survey of 60,000 authors actually, and we got 8,000 responses, and it was specifically asking about open access and how many people had published and what they thought about it. One of the major themes that came back from that is that most authors believe they've been paying for publication in the past anyway, because they've been paying page charges and colour charges, and they're kind of used to having some financial transaction that's related to the paper. So there's not been a huge sort of backlash of people saying, this is real cheek and how dare you. We just haven't experienced that.
Okay. And another this is a very kind of very small focused question about process. And at the point at which the author agrees to transfer, and for some reason this seems important to me, it may not be, does the author actually make the submission and transfer, or do you have staff do that?
No, so we do that for them, actually.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Because is there a time frame in which they have to agree? It can't go on forever, right?
Well, I mean, I think we set a sort of 3-month cut-off point. Right. So if they haven't actually decided, we don't transfer their paper until they agree to have it transferred. So it's not like it's sitting in a system somewhere, and then at the point they want to submit, we take it out of that system and give it to the editor. But we just don't expect. Really, if they haven't done it after 2 weeks, they're not going to do it. That's our experience. I was just going to add one more thing, Barbara, if I may. It's just that so we do publish a couple of other journals, and one of them is for the American Heart Association. It's the Journal of the American Heart Association, and that's a cascade model journal that publishes papers referred from their other titles. But not all of their processes are the same as the ones I've described, because the editorial office for that is in-house at the American Heart Association. Sorry.
There was also a question from
I was just going to go back to the prior discussion of charges to authors. If you may correct me on this, but I believe Biomed Central has a policy by certain universities or institutions are actually paying for or covering all their authors. Is that correct? And if so, is why won't do that?
Well, we like some other open access plus have a membership scheme as well. So we've got membership various. Sorry, I keep doing this. We have a membership scheme that we offer institutions, and there are various versions of this scheme. So one is a prepay membership, and to be honest, I always have to look this up again. But there's a supporter membership. So there are different ways where either the institution puts down a deposit, which is like a prepay scheme, and then every time a researcher at that institution publishes with us, money is taken out of that pot, or a supporter membership whereby it's a flat fee that's calculated on the basis of how many researchers are at the institution, and then that supporter membership gives the authors a discount, which pays towards their article processing charge. So there are various different schemes that we offer institutions in order to make it easier for their authors, for their researchers to publish in our open access journals. We have about 400 memberships at the moment across the whole world.
I think that's rapidly growing, actually. We also offer funder. We're working with funders to set up prepay accounts so that their authors can publish without actually having anything to do with the payment system. But there are also sort of funds that some institutions have where they will just pay for their authors to publish open access. So I think COPE is one of those, which is the 14 institutions, including Harvard and MIT, and they have sort of guidelines on which journals they'll pay for. But the funds are there available to their authors if they want them to publish open access. And I think there's going to be more of that.
There are also an increasing number of funders like the Wellcome Trust who will build the APC costs into the grant, because the Wellcome was trailblazing amongst other funders in this. They very much view the publication as the end point of the research project, and so they build this into. So there are various ways of for authors to get access to funds that cover their APCs.
So I just have one comment about that, the funding approach, and I think the fact that Howard Hughes and Wellcome Trust have been paying sometimes up to $5,000 a paper to get publication explains the motivation for starting eLife.
Just mention a little bit more about that.
Well, this is an open access publication that's being launched now by several funding institutions.
It's Max Planck and Wellcome and HHMI.
Right.
Max Planck, Wellcome Trust, and HHMI.
And supposedly you're not required to publish in that journal if you're funded by those funders, but you're encouraged, I would imagine. And we'll see how that rolls out.
But I think the interesting thing about that is that nobody pays. I mean, the authors are not paying, and, so...
Well, it's because the funders have been paying already. They've just been paying commercial publishers, and now they're basically funding their own journal.
It'll be interesting to see how sustainable that is, though, because I'm sure they're going to get quite a lot of submissions from people who aren't, there.
I think their plan is, for the first few years, is what they're saying, is that it will be free to authors. So it's kind of hedging the bet, I guess.
Right.
Also, with respect to, and this is, of course, anecdotal because I have nothing to do with this journal, but I was talking to Mark Patterson, and who did speak, will be speaking about this and did speak at STM meeting last month, and they are they're setting the bar fairly high for this journal. With respect to our topic on peer review. So, and I did want to follow up, Michaela, with you on some things you said about setting the bar, but I thought I'd wait until we all spoke, because I think that's really important. And so we'll see. They plan to be free to authors for a good 3 years or so. And I think the journal will be launching, as far as I know, very soon. Yeah, right away.
Imminently, I think.
Imminently, yeah. I'm sorry, Barb, did I cut you off?
I had one more question for Rachel, which is, I don't know if you've ever looked to see of the 78% of rejected authors who say, no, I don't want to transfer. Where are those papers ending up?
Well,
PLOS One, for example?
Yeah, I mean, quite possibly. Perhaps Rachel can tell us. I mean, I think, I think that what authors do is that they have in their mind, a tier of publications that they want to work through. And I think, that traditional mindset is changing to a certain extent. So I think, the authors would go for aim high and go for their top choice of journal and then get rejected a few times and end up in the one that's a bit further down their list. I think there's, those 70% of authors are probably doing that, but I think also there's slightly different dynamics emerging, and the speed of publication is rising up the list of criteria in authors' minds about just how quickly can I get this paper out before I'm scooped. And in some cases I think that's becoming almost as important as the impact factor in the next tier of the journal. For some authors, for many it's just still not, the impact factor is the number one choice. But I imagine that that's what's going on, and maybe some of them are opting for other open access journals, but we don't actually track, once the paper's been rejected, where it ends up, and I don't know of a good way to do that, but if anybody does, see me afterwards.
There is a study, and I will have to track it down.
Okay.
It has done that. I don't know if anybody on the panel knows which study that is, and I'll try to, during the break, I'll try to figure it out. But there is a study of a journal that has tracked what has happened to its rejections.
And do you know what the outcome was?
It's a PDF that I filed.
Right. Okay. No, that would be interesting.
So I guess the question that I have is, what's the motivation for an author to publish in a second-tier Wiley open access journal as opposed to just withdrawing the paper and going to PLOS One?
So I think, a major factor in why this model is quite successful, and I called 12.5% reasonably successful is because of the recommendation from the referring journal editor. I think authors, I think if we just did a big marketing campaign and said, come and publish with Ecology and Evolution, we'd get some papers, but it would take much longer to build up. It's the last paragraph in the rejection letter, and I did sort of at one point ask myself if people have screwed it up and, in the electronic world and binned it at that point, and maybe that's what, the 70% are doing. But yeah, I think it's an interesting question, but I don't know the answer to that one.
Just a couple of observations about this. And this may be terribly obvious, and you all have made the same observations already, but I thought I'd express it. And this is particularly about cascading. And the difference, this is no different in creating a new journal that has happened for decades and decades and decades. When you have lots of rejections, an organization might start a new journal. And if you're not clever enough to capture those, as many organizations have been, someone else will. So the difference here is that it's now an open access journal. So there's nothing new about that. Second thing about the cascading, which I think is quite interesting, and I think addresses your question, Barbara, although it's not necessarily an answer, is that authors have their patterns and their preferred tiers. And they go to Journal A, and if they don't get in Journal A, they generally go to Journal B1 or B2, which is their preferred track. They're used to doing that, and in the worst case, they'll go to Journal C. What the cascading will do, and it will see if that will be successful, is kind of changing that behavior pattern. I'm saying, okay, you don't have to go to your B1 or B2, you can go to this journal and we'll make it easier for you. And whether the author finds that attractive or not, I guess still remains to be seen, but there is an attraction to it because in some ways it's easier and there's an implication that it may be easier to get in there. But it is changing a workflow. It's capitalizing on an existing workflow, I think, for authors submitting and trying to change that behavior. And that's my observation on, you probably have all thought of that too, but yes.
Variations on the cascade have been around for a long time. From an author's point of view, the most appealing variation is you're rejected from the journal you submitted to, but at the same time you learn that you have a potential accept at the second journal, sometimes with some proviso, somewhat hedged. Sometimes it can be an outright accept letter. That makes the decision for the author very tempting. Accept at a lower journal now and it's all over, or give up the accept letter and go elsewhere, knowing that you're probably not going to be welcome if you come back to that second journal 6 months later.
Well said. Yes.
That's a good point. Yes.
When an author's paper is referred, do you provide any information about the referred journal? Marketing, promotional, reasons why?
To who?
To the author. Reviewers rejected the paper.
Right.
And it comes back to the author with a referral to the second tier journal. Do you provide any information about that journal to the author?
Oh, okay, right, sorry, yes, I see what you're saying. So we send them to the homepage through that link, and actually, interestingly, we did change that, and it had quite a radical effect. So the link in the rejection letter went to the homepage of the journal, because what authors do is they go and navigate through the left-hand navigation to go to the guide to authors, the aims and scope. And then they make a decision based on that and any other papers they see published there if they're going to submit. And we did actually change that workflow by putting, instead of the homepage, we put in a marketing site, which was, here's what this journal's all about and here's how much it costs to publish, in thinking that this was going to encourage the authors to submit. And in fact, the number of papers that the authors transferred halved. in the time period that we did that. So we took it down quite quickly. And I think the thinking behind that is they don't want to be confronted with marketing. And I think this is, a lot of the press around predatory open access journals has made people feel quite nervous about that. And what they want to actually see is a scholarly journal and something that looks like a scholarly journal and not an advertisement. So that's all we do, is we just say, go and have a look at the homepage and the articles that are there, and that seems to be enough for them to make a decision. But I thought what you were asking actually is, do we give any information when the article is published about where it was first referred to? And the answer to that is no, as well. We considered that, but most of the referring journals don't want to be associated with papers they've rejected.